I am Jack, and what I'm about to tell you is a story that still sends a strange chill deep into my marrow whenever I think about it. It all started with a simple decision. One of those decisions you think is going to be the best memory of your life, but ends up becoming its darkest point. I've always loved nature, the silence and the solitude. That's why, when I found that old abandoned forest, I thought I'd found my lost paradise. No map led there, and no signposts guided the way. It was just me, my backpack, and a deserted road that looked like it hadn't been traveled in years. The trees were so tall and intertwined that sunlight could barely reach the forest floor. As I entered, the air suddenly turned cold, an unnatural chill that didn't fit the summer season at all. It felt like the forest was telling me I didn't belong, but I was too foolish to turn back. The first night, I set up my tent by a dried-up riverbed. The silence there was heavy. No birds chirped, and there wasn't even the sound of wind through the leaves. It felt as if the trees were holding their breath. When I lit the fire, I finally felt how truly alone I was. I was thinking to myself that maybe I'd head back tomorrow, when suddenly I heard it, a very faint scream. It sounded like it was coming from a vast distance. A woman's voice, pleading for help. At first, I thought I was imagining things, maybe a predator or the wind whistling. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. I grabbed my flashlight in a hurry and headed toward the sound. The deeper I penetrated into the thicket of trees, the fainter the voice became. It was as if it were running away from me. When I reached the spot where I thought the sound originated, there was nothing. Only a thick mist coiling around the trees. Absolute silence reigned again, but this time it felt as if thousands of people were watching me. Gradually, I sensed something was wrong. When I tried to return to my tent, I realized the path had changed. The tree I had marked was no longer there. In its place stood a massive black rock. I felt my heart in my throat. I was spinning around when I heard another scream. This time it was a man's voice, filled with terror, as if he were running from something. I ran toward the voice, but the closer I got, the shorter and more tremulous it became, until it cut off entirely. That was when I realized. These screams weren't natural. They weren't just sounds, they were fragments of time. It was as if the forest, like a giant tape recorder, had captured the agony of everyone who had been there before me and was playing it back for me. In that absolute darkness, I felt the trees moving. Not walking, but shifting whenever I wasn't looking, as if to block the path behind me. The wind began to blow, but within the sound of the wind, I heard tiny whispers, thousands of throats whispering together. One was clearer than the rest. A cold, soulless voice right next to my ears said, "You are the last one who can escape." I jumped in terror and swung my light around, but no one was there. Only long shadows dancing on the trunks as my flashlight moved. It was as if the shadows were mocking me. My legs were shaking, but I couldn't stop. I knew if I sat down, I'd never get back up. The whisper-like voice came again, this time from beneath my feet. "There is no way back, Jack." I heard it and froze. They knew my name. How was that possible? I hadn't told anyone where I was going. How did this cursed forest know my name? The trees were now so close together I could barely squeeze through. Dry branches, like bony hands, caught my clothes and scratched my skin. I felt the forest was testing me, seeing how long I could last before I broke. The screams started again, but this time they were simultaneous. Hundreds of voices, each lost in a different time, were now screaming in my ears. Suddenly, I reached an opening, a circular clearing with a severed tree stump in the center. On the stump lay an old wristwatch and a bloody hiking hat. I looked at the watch. Its hands were spinning backward at a high speed. Time had no meaning at this point in the forest. That was when I heard another voice, a very familiar one. It was my own voice. I was screaming for help, but my voice sounded like it belonged 10 years in the future, or maybe 10 years in the past. My brain was about to explode. If that was my voice, then who was I? Was I hearing that voice now, or was I the voice someone else would hear in the future? The forest was playing with my mind. The voices grew louder, repeating a single sentence. If you don't listen, you too will become a scream. I felt my body becoming light, as if my feet no longer felt the ground. I looked at my hands. They were slowly becoming transparent. I could see the tree trunks through my palms. I screamed, but no sound left my throat. Only a faint vibration in the air. The real horror wasn't a monster. The real horror was realizing you no longer exist. Realizing you are just a painful memory trapped in the atmosphere of this cursed forest. The forest wasn't after my flesh and blood. It was after my soul so it could complete its collection of screams. In that moment, I saw a shadow in the distance. It looked like a person coming toward me with a flashlight. I thought I was saved. I wanted to wave. I wanted to scream that I was here, but the closer they got, the weaker I became. When that person reached within a few steps of me, their flashlight beam hit me right in the face, but they didn't see me. They simply passed right through my body and continued on their way. That was when I realized that person was me. At the moment I entered the forest. And I was the very scream I had heard that first night. I was trapped in an eternal loop. I was the scream that had led myself to my death. The forest was conscious, and now I had become a part of its consciousness. The moment I saw myself pass through my own body, it felt like the whole world collapsed on me. That Jack walking with the flashlight still smelled of the outside world. He still had hope. He still thought this was just a simple hike. I wanted to reach out and grab his collar. I wanted to tell him to go back right now and don't look behind you. But my hands were like smoke. The light from his flashlight passed through me and cast a shadow on the trees. Behind me, I was no longer matter. I was just a vibration, an echo of a fear that hadn't happened yet. The forest was teaching me that time here is like a tangled ball of yarn. It has no beginning and no end. When that version of me moved away, the darkness grew thick again. But this time was different. I could no longer hear the sound of my own footsteps. It wasn't absolute silence. Rather, a constant buzzing hummed in my ears. It felt as if millions of insects were crawling under my skin. My gaze fell upon that bloody hat on the tree stump. This time, looking closely, I saw the hat wasn't mine. The name, Tom, was embroidered on it. I remembered. Tom had gone missing in this area 2 years ago. I'd read about it in the papers. So Tom, like me, had been deceived by this wild beauty. Suddenly, I felt someone standing behind me. The chill hitting the back of my neck wasn't the wind. It was the frozen breath of someone who hasn't had lungs for years. I turned slowly. No one was there, but on the trunk of the tree facing me, the bark was shifting in a strange way. It looked like a face was emerging from beneath the wooden skin. The wooden eyes that opened and stared at me were full of sorrow. The wooden lips of the tree moved and, in that same faint voice I'd heard earlier, whispered, "Run, before your roots are felt." A shudder went through my body. I looked at my own feet. My hiking boots were no longer visible. Thin, black branches like small snakes were coiled around my ankles, pulling me toward the ground. This earth wasn't just thirsty, this earth was hungry for my identity. With all the strength left in my being, I tore my feet from the ground and started running. Direction didn't matter anymore. I just wanted to get away from that circular clearing. But the more I ran, the taller the trees seemed to grow. Their branches locked together like the roof of a Gothic cathedral above me, blocking the escape. The voices returned. This time they weren't just screams. It was crying, nervous laughter, and pleading. It felt like I was passing through a massive crowd, though I saw no one. One voice, very close to my ear, said, "Why do you think no one found us?" Because we were never lost. We were absorbed. As I ran, I reached an old cabin, a wooden hut whose walls were covered in dark green moss. A light was on inside, a yellow, flickering glow emanating from the broken windows. A spark of hope lit up in my heart. Maybe someone was there. Maybe it was a real sanctuary. I rushed to the door and pounded on it with my fist. The sound of my fist hitting the wood echoed through the entire forest, as if I were beating a giant drum. The door opened with a long groan. It smelled of must and old paper. Inside the cabin was a wooden table, and on the table lay an open diary. I went forward. It felt like a magnetic force was pulling me toward that diary. The handwriting was familiar, shaky, and irregular. I read, "Day 43. I can no longer recognize my own voice." The forest is swapping my memories with the memories of others. This morning I thought my name was Sarah, but when I looked at my hands, I saw my brother's scars. Terrified, I flipped through the diary. The final pages weren't blank. They were covered in maps that shifted constantly, maps of forest paths designed like the veins of a human body. In the middle of one map, I saw my own photo, the photo I had taken of myself with my phone just today before entering the forest. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. It had no signal, but when I opened the gallery, all my photos were gone. In place of my photos were pictures of strangers taken in various spots in this same forest. A man standing by the dry riverbed, a woman pitching a tent, and a child staring at a tree. They all had one thing in common. In their eyes, the reflection of something black was visible, something like a portal. Suddenly, the phone in my hand grew hot, so hot I was forced to drop it. Before it hit the ground, the phone vanished into thin air. It was as if the forest wouldn't allow anything from the outside world to remain in its domain. I bolted out of the cabin. I didn't want to stay there any longer. But when I turned back, the cabin was no longer there. There was only a massive, ancient tree whose branches were bent in the strange shape of a cabin roof. Had I been inside the belly of a tree the whole time? I was going insane. The forest was shredding reality before my eyes. The voices began whispering again. You are seeing the truth. Your eyes are getting used to the darkness. I felt my skin hardening. When I ran my hand over my face, I felt as if I were touching the roughness of a tree trunk instead of skin. I was changing piece by piece. Suddenly, a light shone from afar, a cold, blue light. Unlike the previous light, this one didn't feel good at all. It felt like a giant magnet was pulling my soul in that direction. The voices screamed together, "Don't go. That is the end of the road." But my legs no longer obeyed me. It felt like the ground was a conveyor belt carrying me toward that blue light. The trees moved aside, clearing the way like soldiers opening a path for a king's entrance. When I reached the source of the light, I saw it was a massive pit. A pit filled with people stacked layer upon layer, but they weren't dead. They were still breathing, but their bodies were tied together with tree roots. They were the forest's power source. And now, a vacant spot right in the middle of that pit was waiting for me. As I stared into that horrific pit, I felt my entire body freeze. Those people, or rather those beings who were once people, had their eyes open, but there was no look in them. It felt as if their souls had left their bodies long ago, and only their physical forms remained as batteries for this cursed forest. Thick, black roots like power cables passed through their mouths and ears and connected to the ground. Every time one of them breathed, the whole ground beneath my feet shook. The forest really was breathing, but through the lungs of its victims. I backed away, but my feet sank into the soil. The dirt there wasn't like quicksand. It was like an open mouth slowly swallowing me. The voices screamed in my head. This time the voices weren't kind. They were harsh and aggressive. They said, "Grab him. Don't let him go. That empty spot belongs to him." I felt bony hands emerge from beneath the soil and grab my ankles. With all my strength, I grabbed the trunk of an old tree so I wouldn't be pulled in, but at that moment the tree shook and its hard bark opened. From the fissures of the tree, a thick, dark liquid like tar emerged, smelling of iron and blood. I pulled my hand back in horror. That liquid spilled on my clothes and began burning the fabric. It felt like acid. While I was struggling for my life, I suddenly noticed something strange. Among all those beings imprisoned in the pit, one of them moved. A man with a long beard and torn clothes who had clearly been here a long time. He raised his head with difficulty and looked at me. His lips were sewn together, but I heard his voice in my brain. He said, "Jack, look for your shadow. Your shadow is the only thing that is still yours." I looked at the ground in surprise. My flashlight, which had fallen on the ground, cast a weak light. My shadow was on the dirt, but my shadow was doing something else. While I stood still, my shadow was waving its hands and pointing toward a direction that was absolute darkness. It felt like my shadow hadn't yet come under the forest's control. The shadow was showing me a way out. Without thinking, I yanked my feet out of the soil with a sudden move and ran in the direction my shadow was pointing. The trees crashed into each other to block my path. The sound of breaking wood echoed through the forest like gunfire. I ran, and behind me, I heard the sound of that pit, roaring with rage. The wind blew as if it wanted to lift me off the ground and return me to that same empty spot. But I only looked at my shadow. It moved ahead of me, faster and more alert. Suddenly, I reached a place where the trees ended and a tall stone wall appeared before me. It was a dead end. I was out of breath and felt my lungs burning from the heat. I turned to look behind me, but what I saw made me wish I'd just died right there. All the trees I had passed were now crawling toward me. They were no longer trees. They were giant creatures with wooden legs plowing the earth to reach me. My shadow fell upon the stone wall and started climbing. It felt like it was telling me I had to go up this cliff. The stones were slippery and cold, but I dug my nails into the cracks and started climbing. The higher I went, the fainter the forest sound became, but a new fear replaced it. From between the stones, long hair emerged, coiling around my fingers. It felt as if this mountain too was made of corpses. When I reached halfway, one of those crawling trees reached the bottom of the cliff. It lashed its long branch toward me like a whip. The branch coiled around my waist and pulled me down with force. I screamed, but this time my voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. I was being returned to that pit. As I lost hope, my shadow detached from the stones. It rushed toward the tree branch like an independent being and grabbed the branch with its black hands. A purple spark was created between the shadow and the branch, and the tree released me with a painful wail. I started climbing again. I finally reached the edge of the cliff and threw myself onto the ground. On the other side of the cliff was a vast plain shimmering under the moonlight. I thought I was saved, but when I stood up to look at the plain, I saw there was no grass or flowers. The entire plain was covered in broken mirrors. Millions of mirror shards spread across the ground. When I looked into the mirrors, I saw thousands of images of myself, but none of them looked like me now. In one I was old, in one a child, and in one, I wasn't human at all. I was one of those trees. The forest me calling from below the cliff. This time the voices weren't whispering anymore. They were calling me with my mother's voice. "Jack, come home. It's cold. Come here to us." My tears flowed. I knew this was a trick, but my heart was being torn out. I looked at my shadow. It stood beside me, but it no longer moved. It too was looking at the mirrors. Suddenly, I noticed my shadow was no longer black. It was turning gray. It was disappearing. If I lost my shadow, I would have no way to distinguish the truth. I put my foot on the first mirror shard. The sound of its breaking was like the sound of crushing bone. With every step I took on the mirrors, I lost one of my memories. I forgot what day it was. Next step, I forgot why I came to this forest. Third step, my mother's name was erased from my mind. I was becoming empty. The forest was erasing me from within so it could fill me with itself. I was becoming an empty vessel, ready to be turned into an eternal scream. With every step I took on those broken mirrors, I left a piece of my existence behind. It felt as if this mirror plane was my brain now spread across the ground. The sharp edges of the mirrors cut the soles of my boots, but I felt no pain. Pain only makes sense when you remember what your body is, but I was even losing the sense of touch. I looked at a mirror beneath my feet. The image in it trembled, and instead of my own face, I saw the face of that man imprisoned in the pit. He was smiling at me, a cold smile with no teeth. It was as if he were welcoming me. The forest sounds had now risen behind me like a massive wall of sound. The trees were no longer behind the cliff. They were climbing the stone wall. The sound of wood scraping on stone was like nails on a chalkboard, but 1,000 times louder. I turned and saw the first tree had reached the edge of the cliff. It stretched its long, black branches over the mirror plane. As soon as its branch touched the mirrors, the images in the mirrors screamed. Every piece of mirror was the soul of someone the forest had swallowed before and was now using as pavement. My shadow, which had now reached a very light gray color, fell to its knees on the ground. It was disappearing, and with its departure, I felt my weight increasing. It felt like gravity had become 10 times stronger for me. Every step I took, my foot sank deeper into those mirrors. Suddenly, I realized the mirrors were no longer solid. They were melting like mercury. My feet sank up to my ankles in a silvery, cold liquid. This liquid was memories, cold, forgotten. Memories. The voice of my mother echoed in my head again, but this time with rage. She said, "Why don't you return? Why are you resisting? Don't you see we are all here waiting for you?" I turned my head and saw that among the trees crawling toward me, one had a strange shape. Its trunk resembled a woman's body, and its branches waved like long hair in the wind. That tree was speaking with my mother's voice. A shudder went through me. I wanted to run, but the silver mercury had risen to my knees. In that moment when I thought it was over, I saw a large piece of mirror standing in the middle of the plain. Unlike the other mirrors, this one wasn't broken. A tall, full-length mirror with a golden frame shining in this wasteland. My gray shadow, with the last of its strength, pulled itself toward that mirror and vanished into its frame. As soon as my shadow entered the mirror, the mercury beneath my feet dried up and turned into solid ground. I realized that mirror was the only way out of this illusion. I ran. The trees were now only a few steps away from me. Their long branches swung in the air like whips, shattering the mirrors beneath my feet. When I reached within a few steps of the full-length mirror, I saw the image in the mirror was my own bedroom in the outside world. I saw my bed, my books, and the window that opened to the street. It was safe there. It was real. But right in front of the mirror, a being was standing. That being bore no resemblance to the trees. It was a mass of black smoke with no fixed form, but thousands of eyes were opening and closing on its body. It was the guardian of this threshold. The black being stretched its hand toward me. It had no sound, but its presence made me feel like all the blood in my body was freezing. It wouldn't let me pass. The trees stood behind me and formed a circle around me. They were no longer attacking, just watching. It felt like they were waiting to see how I would surrender. The black guardian whispered, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of history. "What price will you pay for exit, Jack? No one passes through here for free." I looked at my hands. They were no longer transparent, but were turning dark. I realized what price I had to pay. If I wanted to return, I had to leave part of my existence here. I had to give what the forest was always thirsty for, my heart. No, the forest wanted something more valuable. It wanted the ability to feel. If I passed through here, I could never feel love again, or joy, or even fear. I would turn into a machine that is just alive, but doesn't live. The black guardian got closer. The eyes on its body stared at me simultaneously. I felt my soul being pulled from my chest. The tree resembling my mother said kindly, "Stay, Jack. There is no pain here. Here is only screams, and screaming means being alive. If you go, you will be silenced forever." Doubt filled my entire being. Was a life without feeling better than a death full of feeling in this forest? At that very moment, the image in the mirror changed. I saw that Jack, who had passed through my body, was now packing his tent and walking toward the forest exit with a smile. That Jack was still the same Jack who felt everything. I realized the forest had split me in two. That Jack who escaped was the bright and optimistic part of me, and the one here was all the fears and vices of my existence. The forest wanted to keep me here because I was better nourishment for its darkness. With a loud scream that tore my entire throat, I rushed toward the black guardian. I plunged my hand into the mass of smoke. It was a strange feeling, like plunging my hand into melting ice. The black being trembled and its eyes closed one by one. I passed through the middle of its body and threw myself toward the mirror. Right before hitting the mirror glass, I felt a branch grab my ankle from behind and pull with force. Half of my body was in the real world and half was in the forest's grasp. Between these two worlds, I felt like I was being torn in two. The sound of collective laughter from the trees was the last thing I heard. They didn't want to kill me. They just wanted to keep half of me with them forever. The pressure was so much that my eyes went black. When I regained consciousness, I was on my own bed, drenched in sweat and shaking. The sun was shining through the window, and the sound of sparrows was coming. I breathed a sigh of relief and thought it was all a dream. But when I pulled the blanket aside to get up, I saw that my right ankle, instead of skin, was covered with a layer of hard, black tree bark. And worse than that, when I looked into the room mirror, I saw no reflection. I had returned, but without a shadow, and without a heart that could beat. Again, I sat on the bed and looked at the foot that no longer resembled a human foot. The rough, dark tree bark had settled on my ankle, and no matter how much I scratched it with my nails, I felt no pain. The silence of my bedroom, which always gave me peace, now pressed on my chest like a heavy weight. I got up to splash water on my face, but when I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, I lost my breath. I wasn't there. The image of the wall behind me, the white tiles, and the towel hanging from the hook were all visible in the mirror, but where my face should have been, there was only a hollow, blurred space. I had left my reflection in that forest. For the first few days, I tried to come to terms with it. I told myself that being alive was enough. But the problem started when I realized the outside world wasn't the same world anymore. When I walked down the street, people's voices sounded like radio noise to me. I saw them laughing, crying, or arguing, but I felt nothing for them. No pity, no anger, and no joy. My heart in my chest was like a cold piece of stone that only pumped blood to my veins as a matter of duty. But the real horror came to me at night. When I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of wind through the trees in my ears. The screams I first thought were from strangers were now becoming clearer. One of those voices called my name every night. "Jack, return. Your other half is freezing here." One night, fed up with these whispers, I stood up and looked at my wooden foot. To my disbelief, I saw the black bark had moved higher and now covered up too. Under my knee, tiny, thin branches had emerged from my skin and were advancing toward my thigh. I was turning into wood from within. I realized the deal the Black Guardian spoke of wasn't a finished deal, it was a process. The forest hadn't released me, but like a parasite, it had planted a part of its existence in my body to control me from a distance. I was looking in the fridge for something to eat when my hand touched a cold water bottle. Upon contact with the bottle's coldness, an image sparked in my mind. I was seeing the forest, but not through my own eyes, but through the eyes of that half of my existence imprisoned there. I saw myself standing in the middle of that mirror plane, but now I no longer had a human shape. I had turned into a small, black sapling whose roots were plunged into that silver mercury. That sapling was suffering. Every time the wind blew, my weak branches broke, and I heard the sound of my own scream in my head. Terrified, I let go of the bottle. I realized that as long as that part of me was imprisoned in that abandoned forest, I could never return to a normal life. That forest was feeding on the pain of my other half to grow in the real world. I looked at my house. In the corner of the wall, where the lampshade's shadow fell, black spots had appeared on the wallpaper that smelled of damp soil. The flowers in the vase, instead of drying up, were turning black and taking on strange forms. The forest was entering the city through me. I had to do something. I couldn't allow that darkness to find its way into the human world. I remembered that diary in the cabin. That man had written that the forest swaps memories. Maybe there was a way to deceive the forest. If I could create a false memory, a memory so strong and full of feeling that the forest would swallow it instead of my real soul, maybe I could free half of my existence. But how do you feel something when your heart no longer has any feeling? In my desk drawer, I found an old photo of my mother. I stared at her face. I tried to remember that warmth of her embrace, that smell of jasmine perfume she always wore. But there was nothing, just a flat paper image. The black bark on my leg had now reached my waist. I felt my spine hardening, as if my vertebrae were fusing together. My time was running out. If I completely turned into a tree, there was no way back. At that very moment, I heard a scream from outside the house. It was the voice of a child who had fallen and was crying. For a moment, for just a millisecond, I felt a faint twinge in my chest, a very distant sense of sympathy. That was when I realized the forest hadn't taken all my feelings, it had just imprisoned them behind a massive dam. I had to break that dam. I sat on the ground and closed my eyes. I tried to think of the most terrifying moment of that forest, of that pit of people. Instead of running from it, I imagined myself voluntarily entering that pit. I allowed those black roots to enter my body. In my mind, I surrendered myself completely to the forest. As soon as I did this, a massive pain took over my entire existence. This pain was real. This was what the forest wanted. I was poisoning the forest with my own suffering. Because suffering chosen with awareness is different from suffering out of fear. I could hear the walls of my house shaking. The black bark on my body began to crack. A dark, foul-smelling liquid emerged from between the cracks. I was repelling that parasitic part of the forest. But the forest didn't sit quietly. The sound of wind filled the room, and the windows opened and closed violently. Imaginary tree trunks emerged from the carpet, and their branches reached for my throat. They wanted to cut off my voice so I couldn't scream this suffering. Amidst that chaos, I saw myself again in that mirror plane. That black sapling was now shaking. I ran toward it. This time I was the one without a shadow, and the sapling was the one trying to come out of the soil. I looped my hand around its thin stem and pulled with all my might. The ground beneath my feet opened its mouth, and that black guardian appeared again. But this time he wasn't laughing. He was shaking with rage, because I was taking back something he thought was his forever. The black guardian, with those thousands of eyes on its body, rushed toward me. Every time it blinked, I felt part of my brain twinge, as if it wanted to pierce my memories with its gaze. But I was no longer that weak and fleeing person. I tightened my hand, which was now a combination of flesh and wood, around the stem of that black sapling and roared with all my being. This scream was different from the other forest screams. It was the scream of someone who wanted to be his own master again. With a sudden move, I pulled the sapling out from the heart of that silver mercury. As soon as the roots detached from the ground, the mirror plane shattered and collapsed like glass hit by a stone. I and that sapling fell into a dark void. The black guardian was with us too. Like an ink stain spreading in water, it was blackening the space around us. It whispered, "Did you think it was that simple? You left your roots behind, Jack. You will never be complete." When I hit the ground, I was no longer in the plane. I was in the middle of that same circular clearing from part 1, next to that same severed tree stump. But something had changed. The air was no longer cold. It was hot and suffocating. The sapling in my hand began to throb. It was no longer wood. It was turning into a heart, a large, black heart whose veins coiled around my hand like snakes. I realized this was my real heart that the forest had enchanted. The trees around the clearing began to approach. They were no longer walking, but like waves of a wooden ocean, they crawled on the ground and narrowed the space for me. The faint screams rose again, but this time they weren't asking for help. They were warning me. "It's coming. Hide the heart." From between the intertwined trees, a creature emerged that I had never seen before. It resembled a giant stag, but instead of a head, it had a human skull, and instead of antlers, hundreds of bony hands emerged from the top of its head. It was the forest spirit, the same black consciousness that had been taking victims all these years. That creature made the ground black, and scorched with every step it took. I pressed the throbbing heart to my chest, right where it should be. The pain was like they were opening my ribcage with a hot nail. The forest spirit stopped, and those hundreds of hands on its head began to shake. The sound that came out of that skull was like the simultaneous breaking of thousands of dry branches. "Give back what is mine, mortal. You are just a scream, a worthless echo." While writhing in pain, I stood up. The black bark on my body was melting and pouring on the ground like tar. I said, "I am not a scream. I am the very axe that is going to cut your roots." The forest spirit leaped toward me upon hearing this. Its bony hands sliced the air to tear my heart from my chest again. Right before it reached me, I remembered that wristwatch. On the tree stump, its hands were still spinning backward. I realized the forest takes its power from the past, from the regrets and bitter memories of people. I had to stop time. I dived for the watch and smashed the glass with my fist. The glass broke and the hand stopped moving. In an instant, Everything froze. The forest spirit stayed suspended in the air, and its bony hand stopped a few centimeters from my face. A silence was established that I had never heard in my life. A massive and heavy silence. But this silence wasn't mine. It was the forest, which was shocked. I took the opportunity and pressed my heart into my chest with all my strength. Suddenly, a white and burning light emerged from my chest. This light wasn't from the sun, but from all those feelings I had suppressed. For years. Love, hate, fear, joy. All together they left my body like a massive explosion. The trees began to burn, but not with fire, but with light. They couldn't withstand this volume of real feelings. When the light subsided, I was alone, middle of a scorched and gray forest. There was no more sign of screams. The ground no longer throbbed, and the trees no longer moved. But when I looked at my hands, I saw I was still transparent. I was still a soul. I realized that explosion hadn't saved me, but only destroyed the forest. I heard a sound from behind me. I turned and saw the real Jack, the one who had a reflection and a shadow, standing at the edge of the forest looking at this ruin in surprise. He was safe. He had escaped. And I was half of his existence who had stayed here to save him. I had become the guardian of these ashes. That lone hiker was getting closer every moment. I watched him from behind the thin layers of mist that no longer smelled of death, but of ash and waiting. He was a young man with curious eyes, just like me on that first day. He didn't know he had stepped into a place where time was torn like an old cloth. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say go back. This is the home of lost voices, but my voice was now just the vibration of burnt leaves. As he stepped into the center of the clearing, I felt the ground start to suck again, not with that previous savage power, but like a hungry creature that had just woken up. The black roots I thought I had burned crawled out from under the white ashes. They were like blind snakes looking for warmth. The hiker stopped. He too, like me on the first night, heard a whisper. But this time, that voice was my voice. It was I who was screaming in his subconscious, "Run." But instead of running, he smiled. He took his headphones out of his ears and looked around. For him, this forest was just a pristine and slightly strange place. He didn't notice his shadow had started shaking on the ground. I, who was now a wandering soul in the body of this forest, realized the forest needed me for its survival. It wanted to use me as its new bait. It wanted me to be the voice that leads the next victims into the depths of darkness. I felt parts of my body that were still transparent turning dark. The forest was pouring my memories like gasoline on the fire of its hunger. Suddenly, the hiker went toward the same severed tree stump where I was sitting. He passed right through me. I felt that intense cold that sent a shudder through his body. He ran his hand across the back of his neck and muttered under his breath. It got so cold here suddenly. He brought up his camera to take photos of the scorched trees. I stood in front of his camera lens. I wanted my image to be in his photo. Maybe that way he'd realize he wasn't alone. When he pressed the camera shutter, a weak light from the flash was emitted. For a moment, on the camera's small screen, he saw my face. A face that was half human and half cracked like tree bark. He froze. The camera fell from his hand onto the ashes. Terror rippled in his eyes. Now he too could feel the heavy gaze of the trees. The black roots crawled toward his feet. With more speed, he started running, but in the wrong direction. He was going straight toward the same pit I had escaped from. I couldn't allow history to repeat itself. If he too were imprisoned, the forest would regain power, and I would be imprisoned in this gray body forever. With all the will I had left, I set the wind in motion. I lifted the ashes on the ground and placed them like a wall in his path. From fear, he closed his eyes and stopped. I appeared before him, not as a monster, but as the same Jack I was on the first day. I stretched my hand toward him. He looked at my hand with a shake. My hand was no longer transparent. It was black, like charcoal. Right at that moment, a massive roar rose from deep in the earth. The forest spirit, that creature with a human skull, wasn't dead. Yet, he had only hidden in the lower layers to sprout again. The ground beneath the hiker opened its mouth. With a quick move, I threw him backward. He rolled on the ground, and stared at me in horror. I signaled him to go toward the cliffs, the place where the mirrors were. The forest spirit emerged from the ashes. He was larger and angrier this time. His bony hands stretched toward me. He knew I was a traitor. He wanted to return me to the depths instead of that hiker. I turned to the hiker and said with a voice that sounded like the breaking of thousands of branches, "Don't release your shadow. Just run." The hiker ran without looking behind him. I stayed with that ancient creature. He coiled around me and took me in his bony embrace. His pressure was such that it felt like he was sealing my soul, but I smiled. I was part of this forest, and I knew where its life veins were. I allowed him to swallow me. I voluntarily went inside that black skull. But the moment I entered, I released all that light I had stored in my chest in the previous part. I was like a time bomb in the heart of darkness. The explosion this time was from within. I was destroying myself along with him. The forest spirit's scream echoed through the entire world. The hiker who had reached the edge of the cliff turned and saw the center of the forest exploding like a star. Everything disappeared in a blink. Light, sound, pain, and then silence. A real silence. I woke up, but not on my bed or in the forest. I was in a place that bore no resemblance to anywhere, a white and endless space. Facing me, a person was sitting. It was Jack, the real Jack. He looked at me and said, "Thank you for bringing me back." I looked at my hands. They were no longer black, but they still smelled slightly of burnt wood. We were both staring at each other when we suddenly noticed the walls of this white space were vibrating. It felt as if something from the outside was hitting this space. A familiar sound, the sound of someone's footsteps on broken mirrors. We thought it was all over, but the forest never lets a victim go that easily. We were in a waiting room, and the next person was right behind the door. We too, me and that part of my existence that had escaped to the real world, stared at each other in that white and endless space. The silence there was broken by heavy blows hitting the imaginary walls of the space. Each blow was like the sound of an axe on an ancient tree trunk. We felt massive tremors beneath our feet. The real Jack asked with fear, "Does it mean it's not over yet?" I didn't answer him because I knew the forest wouldn't let go of its prey that easily. That white space began to crack, and from between the cracks, thin black roots emerged like human hair. I realized we had never actually left the forest. That white space was just a temporary illusion, a sort of calm before the storm that my mind had built to escape the pain. The walls collapsed and we returned again to the same mirror plane, but this time the mirrors weren't broken. They were completely whole and transparent, and in each one, an image of our potential future was seen. In one mirror, I saw Jack had returned home and was growing old, but always staring at the window, waiting. In another, I saw he had returned to the forest again, but this time with an axe in hand. The forest was no longer sending monsters. It had understood that I fight with fear and light, so it changed its strategy. Thick mist surrounded us, and the voices began again. This time the voices were kinder than ever, the voices of my friends, voices of people I hadn't seen in years. They said, "Jack, you don't need to fight. Just close your eyes and let us think for you." I felt my feet sinking into the ground again, but this time with my own will. It felt like the fatigue of all these years suddenly poured into my body. The real Jack was sitting on the edge of one of the mirrors, looking at the image of his quiet life. He was being tempted to surrender. I screamed for him not to listen to them, that it was all a lie, but my voice was weak. The forest was cutting the bond between us two. If the real Jack surrendered, I, who was half of his soul, would turn into a wandering shadow forever. With the last of my strength, I ran toward him and grabbed his hand. Upon contact of my hand with his, a spark of real pain filled the entire space. Pain was the only thing that still remained real. We fell together into one of the mirrors. This time when I opened my eyes, we were at the edge of that same abandoned forest. Dawn was breaking. The mist was slowly retreating. The real Jack was standing beside me, panting. We were one again. There was no more sign of being transparent or my hands being black. My skin felt the warmth of blood again. I looked behind me. The forest was right there, silent and motionless. But I knew that underneath, in the depths of the earth, Those roots were still throbbing. I turned toward the road. My feet were heavy, and every step I took, it felt like I was carrying the weight of all those screams with me. When I reached my car, I put my hand on the door handle, but I paused for a moment. I looked at my reflection in the car window. I had returned, but my eyes weren't the same old eyes anymore. In the depth of my pupils, a very narrow vein of dark green was visible. The forest had left its signature on my soul. I got in and started the engine. I left the abandoned road behind and drove toward the city. But the farther away I got, I felt like I had left something behind. Not my watch, not my memories, but a part of that forest silence. When I reached the first gas station and saw the neon lights, I felt everything was too bright and loud. The people there looked like robots moving in a hollow world. They didn't know how close they were to the edge of that cliff. I reached home. Everything was in its place. But when night came and I wanted to sleep, I realized I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the rustle of leaves beneath my feet. I got up and went to the kitchen to drink a glass of water. When I was looking at the small garden behind the house, I saw one of the ordinary trees in the yard had become strangely similar to those forest trees. Its branches were bent in a way that looked like they were pointing toward my room window. I realized my escape had just been a relocation. I came out of that forest, but the forest was now housed in my mind. I could no longer live like a normal person. Every tree I saw in the street was a spy to me. Every whisper of wind was a message. But something had changed. I was no longer afraid. I had reached an unstable peace with that darkness. I knew what they wanted. They just wanted to be heard. I looked at myself in the mirror. I smiled, but my reflection smiled a second later. I was still the master of my own life, and the case of this forest would never be closed. Maybe one day I'll return, not as a victim, but as someone who knows the language of the trees. But for now, I had to learn how to survive in the world of humans while my roots were plunged somewhere else. Tomorrow morning, I woke up and got ready like every day to go to work. Life continued, with all its fears and mysteries. I was still there, more alive than ever, and ready to face anything that comes out of the shadows. Because now I knew the truest horror isn't the one waiting for you in the forest, but the one you bring home with you and which smiles at you every night. I am Jack, and this is just the beginning of a new adventure, because I never return from this path.